Welcome back to opinionsaretefree.com. This is where you can leave your opinion on various topics, and I'd love to hear from you. So, tokenization. I want to talk about tokenization. It can be very confusing, just a term, because token is just a word. You can have a bus token, you can have a carnival token, you can have any kind of representation, which is called a token, or it can be called a slip or an owner slip or an IOU, whatever it is, for any item. Okay. So that's what tokenization is. Now, tokenization of financing, well, then you're adding a token or partial ownership to specific items, and you can break that down like you can break down a dollar. When you're putting it in the bank, it's broken down into a bunch of little dollars through the fractional reserve system. So normally you have a buck, you stick it in the bank, it's broken into however many are allowed in that jurisdiction. Let's just say 10. So you have $10 going out, and you can be loaning those $10 out and making interest on all of those $10, and the likelihood of everyone wanting that $10 back at once is really unlikely. So that's why the system just perpetuates itself. And now when you have unrestricted fractionalization, you can have unrestricted number of dollars coming out of that $1. Okay, so what happens there, and what has been happening, if you know, is that there's an incredibly large debt worldwide. There isn't enough physical money in existence to pay for all of the debt at once. It doesn't happen. It can't happen. Which is why if every deposit holder for a bank went to that bank on a Friday morning and said, we want all of our money, that bank would have to shut its doors and say, you can't have it, because there isn't enough money there. And it's tied up. Even so, there isn't enough money there. So let's talk about tokenization now. I have to ask you something. Will AI equal UBI? And how is tokenization involved in that? So let's go back to tokenization for a second. If you listen to what governments are saying and how they're wording things, they have a very, very, very twisted way, a slippery way of making their comments and putting their policies out in such a manner that they all sound positive but don't really get across the actual negatives that are going to affect you in time. And again, that's subjective. Okay, so when a government says we need to free up capital in order to better redistribute wealth, well, it sounds pretty good. We need to free up capital because capital has to work. I mean, the big people in politics, they're at Davos now. They're talking about how capital has to work, and if you don't have capital working, you can't free up populations. People stay poor. So capital has to work, and you have to put that capital to work. And what happens when it's working? Well, it's working, yes, to help industries grow and whatnot, but it's also being taxed, and it's also being feed. So when this capital goes into the system, somebody's making fees off the use of that capital, and that someone is the people or are the institutions that control the flow of that capital. So the more capital you have, the more fees there are, and the more capital you have in terms of transactions, the more fees there are. So you can have, again, this representing one part of something, and you can have one transaction based on that, and you make one fee. But if you break that into 1,000 pieces, you now have potentially 1,000 times fees. Even if you break that fee down to a smaller amount to say that you're getting a great deal, folks, we're bringing down the cost of doing business. Numerically, it still represents more. Okay. So when governments say they want to free up capital, and what they really mean is they want to find out ways to find more money that can be put into the system, but not at the cost of printing the money, because that has some negative effects. If a government's print money, then you have the valuation of the existing dollars, plus you have the potential to push up inflation, which then has to be answered with higher interest rates, which will cause more problems, because then the people who own the debt or are trying to pay back the debt are now facing a higher rate of interest, and they cannot pay the debt that they couldn't pay off to begin with. So you have debt slavery, and debt slavery is a real thing. Just as you had land slavery way back in the old days with the landowners, you could never really work off your debt. You would just basically work until you died, and you give them a portion of the crops. And when you died, it either goes down to your family and they work the system, or eventually the land will be paid off and you're kicked off somewhere else. Okay, so you have debt slavery. You're working to pay off these debts that will never be paid off, because not only are the interest rates too high, but also because your value as an employee, as a worker, can be easily crushed and manipulated by those who control the debt. And you can do that a number of ways, by either restricting your ability to work, or restricting the number of jobs available to you, or restricting the value of those jobs available to you, or increasing the number of people who can do your job so that there's a lower value to, as you have a lower value as an employee because now you have supply demand economics. So let's say, let's look at the first one here just for fun. Restricting your ability to work. Well, okay, let's look at what's happening in England right now. You have the PM there, or whatever he is, I don't know. He's saying that you need to have a digital ID. Without the digital ID, you cannot work. But even if you were born in that country, you understand? You cannot work without that digital ID. And they say that it's to control unwanted immigration and unwanted migrants. But how is attaching that number to a guy who was born in Leeds 23 years ago or 47 years ago? How is that going to prevent illegal immigrants from coming in if you're restricting that the individual's ability to earn a living? It's a ridiculous system. So again, that's one example of how you can control an individual's right to work and ability to work. Another way to do it is to restrict their occupation. You have changes in occupational types, like, we're going to get off fossil fuels and go to renewables. And, if there's a half workload required for the renewable system as there were for the other system, then now you have a increase in the number of people who are looking for jobs. Another way is to bring in something called AI. Okay. Now, everyone's talking about AI. Oh, it's going to be so much wealth created. Yeah, again, for a very small group of people. The rest of us have a little more in our pensions. Our pensions go up because we're investing in AI companies, and that's great. However, for the majority of people who don't have any money to invest and are losing their jobs because of AI, you're in trouble now. You're in trouble. All right? And again, because there's more profit in having less employees by having the system that doesn't have to pay sick benefits and etc., there's more profit for the companies that use the AI and control the AI and own the systems, right? But you now have a bunch of people around who need to, eat. Well, maybe we'll have to give them UBI, It used to be called welfare, and it was only for a certain group of people who are having trouble working, but now it's going to be called UBI. It's universal. It's for everyone. It's universal. You're all going to get it and be happy. All right? But what kind of a life will you have when the powers that control all the money can determine how much money you're going to get? Now, they'll say that the government's going to control the money that you're going to get, but in reality, the governments work for the industries that create the wealth. Okay? So, again, will AI equal UBI? Probably. And now the governments now have another problem. Well, we need more money. Where are we going to get it? Can't print it. Can't print it. So you know what? We're going to start talking about using the unused capital and unused money in the world, because capital has to flow out in order to create wealth and to perpetuate this wealth. That came out of the mouth of, what's his name? The guy in charge of BlackRock. I can't remember his name, at Davos. And there is some truth to that, because it's the capital that does help, people, that does help communities grow. However, the capital, when it flows, the biggest benefit goes to those who control the capital and either make money off of it by giving it out or by feeing it to death, such as the banks do. And those who at the bottom use the capital are just basically there to create work that will perpetuate the tax system. Okay, it's very hard for the individual on the bottom, even if they work 40 hours a week, work like dogs, for them to find any kind of freedom from any kind of debt. It's just numerically impossible. So now they have to find out where to get more money. Well, where do you get it? Okay, so you have a homeowner. Home is worth $1.2 million. Okay, it's paid off. Government comes by and says, well, you're making capital gains off of the wealth, rather the increase in value of your house, and you're doing it while you're sleeping. That's really not fair, is it? So we're going to start taxing all on that. And you're saying, well, hold on a second. I had to pay for this place. I had to pay to maintain it. I had to pay to fix it. And you want to tax me because I didn't allow it to depreciate to the point where it was now no longer a usable asset. I couldn't even live in it anymore. I can't live in a house with a hole in the roof, can I? No. All right. Tell you what then. We're going to let you take the equity out, and we're going to just have a minimal amount of interest attached to that so that you could use it to improve the economy, to let the money work so that you can then, improve the economy for everybody. Aren't you a good person? Okay, great. So here you go. You now have to take your money out. Now I know older people who have to sell their homes in order to pay for their old folks' homes because those things are expensive. So when you start taxing the equity that they have in their house, which could be the only money they have, you're essentially forcing them now to risk, where their long-term plans of where they're going to live, because they may not be able to. They might outlive their funds. Okay, we're getting into a different topic. They might outlive their funds. So governments then will see all this unused equity in homes and other assets, and they'll want you to use that. One way of doing that is to tokenize those values, because then you can use a portion of those values. So if you have a house that's worth 100,000, you maybe can sell a fraction of the ownership to somebody else, and they can invest it and try to make money off of it and give some of that money to you. Except what happens if they lose money and they lose the value of your token? Are you now on the hook? Probably. Yeah, probably. So it's going to increase, it's going to create a great many implications in tax and the legal system and the ownership system. And I have to wonder if in 10 years from now, we're even going to be able to own private property with the United Nations rulings on indigenous land rights. Yeah. Wow. So anyways, that's another topic. We'll get to that later. But right now, I want to talk about tokenization. So we're tokenizing everything, which will then make everything taxable, theable. Will that actually lead to more wealth for everyone, or will it essentially create more wealth for a smaller group of people and a bigger bubble of debt for another group of people? I'll give you an example. Let's just say this. So here I've got this lens, right? It's an old lens. Right now, if I were to sell this in the US or in Canada or in England, I don't have to pay or remit any kind of tax on this because there are thresholds. In Canada, it's $30,000. If I sell $30,000 worth of camera equipment, I have to then collect HST because it's deemed that I'm a supplier, not just a private individual. And that may change in your jurisdiction. So let's say that we attach a token to this, okay, $30, and I want to sell you the item. Now, there's a record of this ownership of this item being transferred from me to you, and now that can be taxable. Okay, and if I don't attach a token to this, there's no way for me to transfer the ownership legally unless I just give it to you and get the money. However, if the money is digital, there has to be a record of how that digital cash came from you to me. You understand? So in other words, when we go digital, and we will go digital for this very reason, you cannot then transfer the ownership of anything from person A to person B without potentially incurring a tax, because that has to be registered. That fund, that money, that currency has to be tracked from A to B and has to be attached to something, which now something physical, or even if it's something not physical, that is a taxable item. So governments will love this, because now that means that if you have all these little goods that were previously just sold privately are going to be taxed, you can now make tax, or rather are going to be sold, you can now make tax on the value of all those items, right? And the institutions which control the flow of the digital currency can make a currency fee or a transaction fee on all of that digital currency. So tokenization will lead to higher tax implications. It will lead, yes, to more capital being put into the system, but that system itself is not going to get any better, because it will probably simply, my speculation is that it'll simply lead to an expansion of the debt base. So those who are owing now will just owe more, but the low stuff that they can't afford to get rid of. If all you have left is your house and you're just barely making the payments and you're doing okay, do you really want to gamble with the equity in your house and risk not even having that? Okay. And when AI is on board, the only way to keep people eating, well, get rid of a few people that will solve the problem, is to give them UBI and essentially make everybody a slave to the system. The days when you cannot buy or sell anything without a number attached are coming. They're coming. So that's just my opinion. Yours may be different. Opinionsarefree.com. Leave your opinion, and hope you're doing well. Bye-bye.